So, hello, welcome back. This is going to be a bit of a revisiting video and revisiting why I think the Amtrak 2035 map is relatively bad, and a follow-up as to what I think we could do, how much, why, other things, and what, frankly, an Amtrak 2035 system map could look like. And there's going to be a few basic limitations on this, being the what if funding is effectively twice what's being proposed in the infrastructure bill, so around 132 billion would be the total. This also entirely excludes, or at least mostly excludes, the Northeast Corridor. The reason being is that they pretty much always get their funding, so I don't really see a reason to include them in on this. And also, secondly, I don't live in the Northeast, I live in California, and I care more about the 300 million of us that don't live immediately along the Northeast Corridor, so this will be mostly focused on the rest of the country, which tends to get overlooked by Amtrak. So, what I don't like about the Amtrak 2035 plan, map, whatever you want to call it, is that it's based on Amtrak requesting the tiniest amount of funding possible for the rest of the country just so the Northeast Corridor gets its deferred maintenance backlog cleared. Considering the issues with climate change that are frankly starting to stare us in the face with massive wildfires and flooding and just all sorts of other fun stuff, it's honestly, Amtrak's plan is completely pointless at this point. Amtrak needs to be carrying somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 times as many people as it did in 2019 by the 2030s, not barely doubling its capacity in 15 years. Assuming the states even care to play nice with Amtrak, which for a lot of their routes is a really big if. And it's also a non-starter for me. So the basic idea is that Amtrak is what they could do if they were given $132 billion national capital plan, $22 billion per year in ongoing funding, and Amtrak gets the ability and mandate to use the money with impunity in states, regardless of whether or not they cooperate with Amtrak. On the subject of the federal government providing more money for state services, I don't really get why this is controversial other than the mentality of it's never been done that way, so why should it ever change? Which is honestly the only argument I've really seen against this. But when it comes to highways or Social Security, everyone in every state gets some level of benefit from this. And as far as I'm concerned, if highway funding is going to be funded to some basic level, and that's off the table as far as being a state-by-state thing is, rail should frankly also be off the table as far as having a basic level of funding. So for the reinvestment, which I've just kind of plopped in on here, that we'll just be talking about. So the main part is to upgrade the existing miles, which would be about 700,000 per mile, to basically fix any maintenance that would possibly be there. I know this also would include the Northeast Corridor, but 470 some odd miles out of 20,000 is not really that much. 28 billion for basically growing the system. This is also based on the cost per mile for upgrades being about 1.7 million, and I put an asterisk on this one because that varies a lot, because I think it's the south, not the southwest, but the southeast, where they're trying to get the work between Mobile and New Orleans. I think that's going for around 700,000 a mile, so the price and mileage will vary based on any number of factors that are innumerable to go into, like track condition, geography, whether or not what the host railroad wants. It's just a very it's a very up in the air thing. The big line item is honestly for passenger cars, which would be 49 billion for about 14,000 of these, and we'll get into those in a minute, and then 1,000 locomotives, so about another 12 billion. And then for facilities, which would be like stations and maintenance facilities, 23 billion, because again, there's really wide variability between how much a station costs versus in a facility. Like building tracks and warehouses, also not particularly expensive, as well as building stations, but the cost also varies a lot because of land. And then development, meaning like upgrading technology, hiring and developing their workforce, because any major expansion is going to require a lot more people to work. And then just a buffer about 5.5 billion in case some things cost more than others, which honestly is and I don't know. And then just to get out of the way, the ongoing funding being about, well, it's supposed to be 22 billion. I just can't add or just didn't type that right. So ignore that on the slide, but the total is 22 billion, not 20. Just putting that out there because I typed that wrong. Anyways, it would be 9.9 billion for ongoing capital, 7.7 billion for the state services, quote unquote, which would just be proportionally allotted between all the various states, and then 4.4 billion for national operations funding. And this is also where I'm going to start talking about a few things that will probably be controversial to some people, at least, is that I'm not really going to mention much about DMUs, because the question of why am I not talking about them is not just gonna be answered here. And the easy answer is they have their own issues, and notably one of them is not being flexible when and if demand changes. And given how underserved the US is by rail, having the most flexibility when it comes to equipment is going to matter more than, well, being lighter and possibly better with acceleration. And not to mention the rest of the world isn't 100% multiple units either. They have their advantages and disadvantages, and honestly, people, and this is going to be a kind of a thing that's going to come up through this kind of loose series of urbanism, is that people really need to start being aware that there are actually trade-offs to things, meaning they both have their good and their bad things, and you actually have to choose between options. There's no like one always universal superior option to another. And right now, given that the state of the US rail system is, well, deficient, to put it nicely, flexibility in inducing mode shift is frankly more important than honestly living up to someone else's definition of perfect, and honestly crapping out a bunch of, well, frankly, something similar to what the Midwest is getting and what Amtrak just ordered for the Northeast is honestly going to matter more than, well, perfection. And also, this is the case where I'm not really going to talk about, us having an electrified rail system with multiple units running every 5 minutes in every possible directions. And also, since I'm not an activist or politician, I don't have to play the I only advocate for the perfect crap. So multiple units would come someday, but right now mode shift to me is more important, which is what I'll be mostly focusing on. Which also brings up the second point, which is I'm not going to talk about electrification either. The freight railways don't really give a crap about electrifying, and frankly, there wouldn't be enough passenger corridors with service similar to the Northeast Corridor outside the Northeast to justify a rolling program. And the way we would get there is right-of-way nationalization, which is a video I've already made a topic I've made a video on, excuse me. So hopefully I'm going to link that, even though I've also swearing at myself in my own notes to tell me to link it, so hopefully I will. So the main difference between Amtrak that I wouldn't want to have and Amtrak we do have and what they plan to do are that we'd get a lot more services, mostly in the state services around the country. Currently, Amtrak runs about 300 plans per day, and what I would guess as a minimum point would be Amtrak running nearly 2,000 trains per day just as quote-unquote state-level services. And again, minimum service level. Given that there would be capital money always available in this scenario, it's not hard to imagine that more trains would end up running either by this time or as time goes on. And a rough capacity estimated for this on my part would be Amtrak having the annual capacity of roughly 260 million people, or about 8 times Amtrak's 2019, or not 8 times, 4 times. Wait. Yeah, about 8 times Amtrak's 2019 ridership. I know that Amtrak would honestly not have every train running at 100% capacity every day of the week, but even if Amtrak only hit 50% of the total capacity, that would still just be a massive increase in ridership. Now I'm going to make the point that since a lot of people won't pick up on this, not every route across the country will be an hourly route, like on the Northeast and in some parts of California. Some will only have 2 round trips per day, some will have 4, some will have 10, some will have 16, some probably will have 30. I don't understand why people hear corridor and automatically just assume that's going to be, the Northeast corridor. Regardless of any local conditions. Most routes will end up being like the San Joaquin, where they run a couple of times per day, not a couple of times per hour. So this is about 2,000 trains per day over 180 or some odd routes across the country. The next major change would be, in addition to what I'd be calling daylight and owl routes across the country, effectively, they are longer distance coach and overnight trains. So kind of like the Palmetto, Carolinian, or Vermonter. They would, designed to run across state lines that are too far for state routes, but not really far enough to be a long distance train. And, the routes that I would have come up with, I was going to make a map for this, but honestly, this was already hard enough to make, the one I'm already showing, so we'll just kind of roll with it. Is that the routes would end up carrying about a capacity of 26 million. And then the last one would be major expansion of like long distance trains. And this is actually an older map that I didn't fully update since I ended writing this, but so we'll just kind of roll with it. Now the last main expansion is the long distance trains, which Amtrak currently runs about 15. I would honestly add 14 more and expand the service on the existing routes. So for example, adding a twice daily Western Star to the Empire Builder, and the Western Star possibly having more stops than the Builder itself. In a similar vein that secondary trains had, the American Rail Network in the days before Amtrak. And a little rub I actually have with this, with respects to Amtrak, is that they actually did kill off like all of these that were in existence in 1971. So this is a channel that mostly focuses on the history of trains, not so much the future of them. But not every railroad before Amtrak was the Southern Pacific that basically tried to kill off all of its passenger trains in the decade before Amtrak that it could. For example, the Burlington Northern and its predecessors were still running its flagship trains and their companions until Amtrak took over. And if it weren't for Don Russell and his aggressive push to kill off as many SP passenger trains as possible, trains like the San Francisco Overland or the Owl or Lark would probably have kept running up until when Amtrak was formed. And the same would be true for other railroads across the country. Many of them had their Don Russells who were hell-bent on killing passenger trains off. And also, this is me saying that we kind of do need to reverse that, and frankly, tri-weekly service is next to worthless. 3 trains per day, we're getting somewhere. The other thing I also would like to talk about on this map is that, yeah, there's like a bunch of little like not spine routes, but like little branch line routes in various parts of the country, which is going to be the last level of service I'm going to talk about. This is some of its service for people in rural areas and Native Americans, and I was going to originally start out by adding service to reservations, but after seeing how few reservations have rail lines that are even near them, I didn't see this as being something that would help very much. Yeah, some reservations do have reasonably direct service, and in the case on this map, some of them are shown. Yeah, and for the most part, this is in going to be all like Oklahoma and the Dakotas and a few in Montana and Wyoming. And also the gray lines on the map are like little areas where that could probably have a throughway bus or some other better coordination with Amtrak. And if you allowed the trades the same amount of money as a state, it would net them about $119 million to plan services collectively. And the reason I didn't just add a lot of routes because of the frankly low dispersion of the population, and also as mentioned on the map, it's mostly just benefiting Oklahoma. And I'm also aware that there are other issues on reservations, but this is just my wheelhouse, so that's why we're talking about it here. So one of the things that came up in the last video that I kind of want to make a brief stop over here is what is a hub when we talk about Amtrak? So is it Chicago Union Station and nothing smaller, Washington Union Station and nothing smaller, or is it any major station where multiple services, in this case Amtrak and throughway buses, interchange with each other? Because this is a thing that actually came up during the last video, which is one of the comments being is like, oh, Nashville will never be a hub. So that's the thing though. What do you mean by hub? Is a hub just any major city in its central station where a bunch of different routes intersect? Are we talking only Chicago? Which is a thing that I tend to go with the last definition on here, just an area where multiple services in a big city interchange with each other, or can. So the idea that, oh, if it's smaller than Chicago, it's not a hub regardless of any services, and it doesn't deserve services anyways. Again, not a thing I'm going to be talking about, or is a thing I am going to be talking about, but is just a point I wanted to make. Now, before we get into how something like this can be executed, I'd like to talk about bus service in this country. Since the pandemic started, intercity bus service has been pushed, frankly, to the brink of collapse, and there are even talks about Greyhound going bankrupt again due to the fallout of the pandemic, and its Canadian subsidiary has already permanently ceased operations. And we're possibly facing down the only other form of nationwide intercity ground transportation completely folding. This issue with all of this is that the average Greyhound rider makes something less than $40,000 annually, and they tend to serve areas that Amtrak doesn't, which means that people who are transit dependent might be losing their only form of intercity public transportation, assuming states don't step up, which, I mean, frankly, a lot of them aren't. So option one is nationalizing Greyhound and consolidating it into Amtrak. And this would be probably the most expedient option since First Group in the U.S. is only worth about $1.5 billion, and Greyhound is a part that they're currently trying to sell off. And since Greyhound is also reasonably breaking even before the pandemic, which means it wouldn't really drag down Amtrak that much, were they to merge together. And there would also be other things that have to change with Amtrak, but we'll get to that in a minute. The other option is giving Amtrak about $1.5 billion to buy buses and build maintenance facilities and train people and, effectively build its own nationwide bus network. Given that it would cost the same, to give Amtrak the money to build its own network as it would to be, buying out First Group's U.S.-based assets, it would just be more expedient to buy out Greyhound. And the reasoning I could see for building a competitive system instead of buying the existing one is that having a duopoly is better than a monopoly for competitive reasons. I could see this argument and would normally agree with it. The problem is that First Group has been wanting to sell Greyhound since before the pandemic, and the pandemic has battered the industry to the point of basically collapse. Like airlines, they saw an 80 to 90% drop in their ridership. But unlike the airlines and Amtrak, they only got $100 million from the COVID bailouts compared to the multiple billions per airline, which wasn't enough for them to keep people on the payroll, which meant up to 100,000 people being laid off. This is for the whole industry, not just Greyhound, mind you. And the second point is that Greyhound is basically the only national bus service. There are plenty of local companies around the country, but none of them compete directly against Greyhound by and large. Which means if Greyhound goes under, that's honestly all for a lot of people in a lot of small and mid-sized towns across this country. Which basically means all of this makes more sense, to me at least, to effectively just have Greyhound be absorbed into Amtrak, more than would make sense for Amtrak to build its own network of buses across the country. And since the cost would be the same, there's no guarantee that Greyhound or any of the regional carriers would survive long enough in the current market with, honestly, the lack of federal support, especially coming out of COVID. And the other part of this would just, honestly, I'd add like $45 billion towards building expressways across the country for the buses. Express lanes already exist around the U.S. for people willing to pay tolls for them, and having them for buses only, or at least more of them for buses and other commuters, would do a lot to help bus ridership, since this would make it a faster option during rush hour, and bus services can be deployed faster and for less money than new rail routes, and compounding buying out Greyhound with Amtrak being able to more easily run throughway connections for its existing services to outlying towns. Greyhound already providing the largest chunk of throughway connections. Integrating them sort of would make some sense. Not to mention that the rest of this would make a lot of new rail lines that would go further to compete against Greyhounds and other bus operators anyways. And final note on the $45 billion for expressways. It's basically 1 year of highway spending at the federal level, so adding an extra year on top of it, or spreading it out over like 30 years, not a huge amount of money being spent, but again, more on that in a minute. So I mentioned some things having to change with Amtrak in general for any of this to work. The first two things being is I'm getting rid of the micro rule for food service and getting rid of the 750-mile rule, which bars any route under 750 miles from getting federal funds. The micro rule, if I remember correctly, and if I put this in the notes correctly, rather, is the just micromanagement on the part of Congress, trying to force food service to break even, regardless of if the train itself does or the whole of Amtrak does on its own. And cafe cars and their equivalents to our history basically never broke even. Like, yeah, dining service and like bar service has potentially, like bar as an alcoholic, not bar as in like some countries refer to their like dining options as bar cars. They may have broken even or made money on their own, but cafe cars and their equivalents basically never have. The point of them is to provide extra value to potential riders so they choose the train over, frankly, driving. And the 750-mile rule would need to go, and it might in the infrastructure bill, but it would be a 500-mile rule, which is still just as stupid. Well, what would be saved in other costs of society would more than justify the federal government spending money to operate trains at all levels of service being discussed. And as mentioned previously, we get a guaranteed minimum of road funding and airport funding. Trains honestly should be no different. And the change on the state side of things, being that other than it being divided proportionally amongst all the states, and don't really know what Alaska and Hawaii would do with their chunks, but we'll just kind of gloss over that for now. Well, Alaska does have the Alaska Railroad, so at least it would go for them. But the thing is, though, is that I would either have the mandate be as Amtrak uses it directly, or in the state that it's allotted for, regardless of whether or not the state DOT is allowed to help them plan and run the services. And this is also where I'll make another note that I will talk about the California's JPAs. They're essentially a failed structure and shouldn't be allowed anywhere near federally mandated services, or at least federally mandated funding. If a state wants to be stupid and let them plan services above and beyond whatever Amtrak wants, with or without the state DOT, I don't really have a problem with it. But letting local politicians who should be worrying about paving sidewalks or buying fire trucks have no business running services like intercity transportation or education when they otherwise wouldn't be asked to do so beyond the state's politics being mind-numbingly stupid in some way. So various California JPAs would be out of their second or third jobs, and either Caltrans would have to nut up and deal with the services it should already be doing, or Amtrak would just have to be the adult in the room, which gets us onto another point, is that you'd also have to require Amtrak be run by people who have more qualifications than sharing a political identity and having a recent head injury. Getting people who have worked in hospitality or transportation industry is also a good start. At best, we get someone like Mike Flynn, who's currently running the show, having experience in logistics and rail and a bunch of other related industries, which is good. Not going to say that's bad. But the board is also filled with a lot of political appointees that frankly don't deserve to be there. It's one thing to have a political spoil system, but at least make the beneficiaries halfway competent at their job and halfway deserving. Amtrak would also need to standardize, along with having people that actually know what they're doing, offering like their product offerings being standardized. So a regional coach and business class are the same no matter what the route is, branded as, whether it's a state service, a national service, whether it's also state service but they don't do their own branding. So business like 2+1 with snacks and a meal on longer trips, and a 2x2 coach with 39 each as a pitch, and system-wide checked baggage service. Another thing that I would also mandate would be a standardized fare structure for the state routes. An example being like having a $6 base fare to like pay for like the stations and marketing and just generic administration, and then a 10-cent per mile charge. And at least around California, this would put Amtrak state routes on a similar pricing point to Greyhound, further compounding why it should just be nationalized and merged into Amtrak. I would also make it so that as far as budgeting and like administrative going, that these state services essentially be run as a concession model rather than the normal state-supported model, which would make Amtrak disclose the costs a lot more and allow them to possibly make money and Congress maybe not feel cheated. On the national network though, but I'd leave their fares be, because the fare buckets work and they serve a lot of people, and what can be done to make them better is frankly already mentioned. Why I would use as a rule to denote between a state and an interstate or national network service would be a mix of mileage and dealing with state borders. Frankly, anything under 300 miles I would consider a state route if it mostly runs within one state. I know there would be some exceptions to this rule, especially when dealing with service into and out of New York City, generally to central Pennsylvania and possibly other parts of the Northeast and the Downeaster itself. But the same isn't true, so between 110 and 300 miles would pretty much should always be a state route. Where there might be multiple states involved, the easiest way to deal with the funding issue is just have the shortfall covered by each state based on a percentage of the miles that the route passes through. Interstate routes, on the other hand, I'd say should be at least 300 miles and serve 2 states at least. I would also have a percentage test here for these routes. So if more than 55% of the mileage is in one state, then it's still a state route regardless of its distance, which would mean the existing Michigan trains would still be Michigan trains. And if the Capital Corridor was ever extended from Salinas to Reno, it wouldn't qualify either. Again, this is more complicated and Congress members aren't paid to read, but this would enable there to be a lot more services and less chances of freeloading, which is usually the reason Congress is stupid on domestic issues or claiming everything is socialism and or fascism, depending on your political persuasion. So case closed, we're done, right? And nope. The question someone will have is, where's all the equipment going to come from? So, insert whatever this is, screeching buzzkill. And I know this picture is heavily pixelated because, well, internet sucks sometimes. This is also where the planning comes in, mainly on the production side, which brings us to cars. Car chassis are made on a largely automated assembly line that makes the components and welds them all together. Something like this would have to be done for trains and set up somewhere, which would be a reason to have a big work program in the Rust Belt. The auto companies we bailed out are still bailing on the Midwest, so having Siemens, Stadler, and Alstom agree to a common shell design and having one giant factory rolling them out on a massive assembly line to the tune of like 2,000 or 3,000 per year, and the appropriate number of locomotives would be necessary. This also brings me to why I still have capital funds, even if this is part of a large program. The main reason why rail equipment is so expensive is because we don't have economies of scale in this country. We maybe order, 200 cars a decade in this country, which is barely enough to sustain one manufacturer, let alone like 3 or more. Having a huge order coupled with a constant trickle for more equipment would at least keep some of the assembly lines going, or at least all of them, hopefully, which means skills wouldn't be lost, since people who gain these skills would be employable in other fields, so they tend to only be on the job for like a year or two longer than the project takes to complete. So one large order coupled with a bunch of small ones would be better than a few small orders stretched over decades, at least when it comes to skill preservation and maintaining industrial capacity, since finding and training people takes, frankly, a lot more money than you'd think. The other component we need to talk about is budgeting and project management. As far as budgeting goes, frankly, all of this money should be made available. I say available in quotes. At the same time, some people will freak out about inflation or the government not looking like it's fiscally responsible, quote unquote. But frankly, that doesn't matter. Printing money doesn't cause inflation on its own. You need to have a shortage in something to start doing that. And it's not like Amtrak or any of its contractors could spend all the money at once. Yes, the money may be budgeted for new equipment, but it's still going to be a while before it's actually spent on anything. Which brings me to project management and how we would, start upgrading things. It would make sense that all the supply orders, meaning, ballast, rail, signals, and other sorted whatnots all get routed through Amtrak, and Amtrak buy everything rather than whoever is getting contracted to do this. This is also another economies of scale thing. If Amtrak could order enough building materials to tie up a significant amount of production, it makes sense for them to do a bulk order for things rather than each contractor do it on their own. Because if Amtrak has a constant flow of supplies, it could ship things where needed more efficiently than the contractors can, or even to some extent the producers. Secondarily, it also makes sense to do the same thing for the cars. Having one design that's the same shell, the same HVAC system, bogies, brakes, electrical systems, basically everything that can be the same until it can't, is cheaper. Yes, a sleeping car and a coach are different, but that doesn't mean the AC system or the brakes are. Even if Siemens, Stadler, and Alstom are all making cars, a common design could, and supply chain would make things more efficient. This country produces over 70,000 cars domestically a year, so we could easily produce 2,000 to 3,000 passenger coaches if we had the desire to, and a couple hundred locomotives. But we'd need to put some project management, central planning behind it, and central planning is a good thing for big projects. Hell, we kind of won a few world wars by doing that, even though the government also screwed some of that up. But again, central planning isn't necessarily a bad thing. As for spending the money and why it shouldn't be doled out in the smallest way possible, so Congress, their first impulse will be to make sure this money is divided over a 30-year time frame. With how limited the money can be used and how quickly Amtrak could actually use it, it's not like they could spend it all on cocaine or something. It doesn't matter if you have the money and nothing to buy, so allowing Amtrak to use the money as basically leverage would make more sense. Yeah, the government might look irresponsible for a year, but when doesn't it with money, frankly? It's always spending money on less productive things than Amtrak, and allowing Amtrak to spend money as it needs it within guidance from the Department of Transportation would also, again, make for better economies of scale, more efficiency on the whole, since contractors and suppliers can better plan to serve the demand. Not to mention Amtrak having more money would give them more leverage in contract negotiations. So again, just showing the map for a brief moment. And yeah, I did kind of put the possible connecting via rail services up here in Ontario, just as for instance. I forgot to mention that on the first thing. So the second thing I'm going to talk about is potentially replacing the essential air service with an essential transportation service. This will eventually be incorporated into its own video at a later date. which would be, about $1 billion for funding rural transportation services so the states could plan and fund bus, train services, potentially air services on their own. Originally, I was going to talk about having a nationalized Greyhound be the one benefiting from all this, but after doing some digging into past attempts at subsidizing rural transit and potential issues with creating a ground transit monopoly, I kind of changed my mind on that. The reading I did into the reports that went out just after deregulation in 1982 talked about how some states and local governments worked to maintain or restore services in the wake of deregulation. The main topic was that some states either paid for an extension of the local transit network to meet a Greyhound or Trailways bus at wherever they met the bus and at whatever time, or just outright paid for an intercity bus route. The problem with these solutions seems to have been that they were either not well coordinated with each other or with what people needed or wanted, and at least when it comes to the more local solutions, the solutions that seemed to last the longest were the ones where some public entity paid to keep an existing route running rather than running a connecting service or reviving an already canceled service. Meaning it would make more sense, at least in my opinion, for the states to use the money to create an in-state, intercity, and regional bus network that coordinates with the local and other forms of regional transportation to act exclusively as an extension of, rather than acting exclusively as an extension of Amtrak. They could coordinate when it makes sense to do so, and if they wanted to, but it shouldn't be a requirement. This also means that publicly sponsored bus networks should either be the state subsidizing private companies to run a network, or planning and having most of the services run under a contractor model or directly by the state DOT. And this would also kind of partially revive the old Trailways network, which would make a somewhat nationwide competitor to Greyhound, whether or not it was nationalized. And whoever ended up as the contracted operators for these routes would have could have for-profit routes to run to connect the subsidized ones, which would further expand the usefulness of the network, which was a kind of a problem in the late 80s, or mid to late 80s rather. The overall bus network at the time was losing connectivity, along with small town services being cut to the point of being useless. In the first 3 years of deregulation, for example, nearly all the services cut were in towns of 5,000 or fewer people, and to edge cities of 50,000 or less. An edge city being a town that's like outside of the urban core, but still kind of in the orbit. So like what Stockton, California is to San Francisco and Sacramento, but it's still kind of out on its own. There are other things that could be done to integrate the various forms of public transportation, and I'll largely leave this for its own video in the future. But the two big ones are sharing stations and having a common payment app for all ground-based transportation in this country. On the station front, a lot of agencies and companies are already doing this. Sometimes a city or county has built stations for their bus networks, and Greyhound ends up using them, as well as, potentially for Amtrak and Amtrak stations. When it comes to a common payment app, short of the federal government getting involved, I'm not sure that this will happen in any effective way, mostly because Google doesn't care about public transit, and a lot of public transit agencies are pretty, honestly, tech illiterate. Which brings us back to the map on screen. I'll make the note that I don't know how much of Greyhound's network or existing services would survive a merger with Amtrak, especially a growing Amtrak, considering they were breaking even before the pandemic, and that private companies tend to sell things off not because they're losing money, but because they're not returning enough. There is no reason to assume the existing Greyhound network wouldn't pay its own way. And as time goes on, I could see Amtrak replacing some routes with train service, assuming they have comparable travel times and they can get track access. The exchange being that there being more throughway services to nearby cities and whatnot. I will also note that at one point Greyhound pretty much had a much more extensive map, which is this is a map I actually found on Pinterest, or a picture of one, which I'm guessing is from the mid to late 80s, so sometime after deregulation, but before the worst of the cuts. And as you can see, there's still like pretty okay service in the Dakotas, what looks like a direct route from Phoenix to Vegas, really extensive service in the Midwest, Plains, and the South, a direct connection to Winnipeg. And services here on the West Coast have also pretty dramatically declined. Eastern Oregon and Washington State have also been pretty hard hit. Bend, Oregon, I don't think has any service now. And there used to be services between Redding and Eureka, which is on the coast of California, the far northern coast, as well as service north of Eureka up to Portland on the coast, and direct services between like Sacramento and Tahoe and Carson City and up to Reno, which is long gone. And as far as I know, even the Amtrak throwaway bus doesn't even go to Carson City anymore. And at one point, Greyhound had a reasonable, close nationwide competitor, which is the Trailway Transportation System, which was a loose alliance of bus companies that operated service in conjunction with each other. The main founders of the system were the Burlington Trailways, owned by the CB&Q, Santa Fe Trailways, owned by the Santa Fe, Missouri Pacific Stages, which I'm guessing was owned by the Missouri Pacific, as well as other companies that worked together to provide coast-to-coast services to compete with Greyhound. As time went on, they also declined and were largely absorbed into Greyhound. And I'll eventually make a video about passenger services railroading during the Depression, where I'll go into greater detail in how the trailway system got going. So to end this and steer it back towards Amtrak, they'd end up with a Amtrak system, or we would end up with an Amtrak system that covers more of the country than Greyhound currently does, and possibly Amtrak having its own nationwide bus network along with it. Excluding what a nationalized Greyhound would offer, Amtrak would have the capacity to carry around 311 million people, not the paltry 50 million it wants to carry by 2035, and would run about 2,200, or just short of 2,300 trains rather per day. And again, these are minimum numbers, not maximum numbers. Things need to grow or else they end up declining. And this also doesn't bring us to anywhere near to the World War II level of peak traffic. In terms of intercity rail traffic, it would probably bring us somewhere to the time period between 1947 and 1956 in terms of capacity. When it comes to overall ridership, I'm not sure where 311 million sits exactly in that time frame. I know the wartime peak was over 700 million, and now we're sitting around 150 when you include Amtrak and all the commuter rail services. So Amtrak having 311 million on its own is a good starting place. For example, the 700 million number would mean that the average person would make 5 intercity rail trips per year in the late 1940s. And if this were to happen again, well, this could happen again rather, but I'm not sure how fast it could. If we hit 700 million intercity passenger train trips a year, this would be the equivalent of the average working age adult taking 3 round trips per year with a little bit left over. And an intercity trip is one that is over 50 miles and not for commuting. And the average train and car and bus trips are 190 to 200 miles, so it's not like rail would really affect the airlines all that much. But I'll talk about airlines, public transit, and a bunch of other stuff in later videos in this series. And I hope you did enjoy. And yeah, I did change the, what's it called? We're doing more legit slideshow, not just well, whatever it is I was doing earlier. Anyways, I will see you in the next one.